Ladies and gentlemen, something explosive just shook America. If you thought the Minnesota fraud scandal was bad, what just surfaced this week blew the entire story wide open. President Donald J. Trump, speaking firmly from the Oval Office, has now linked the Minnesota welfare fraud operation to something far darker, far bigger, and far more dangerous than anyone expected. And let me tell you, Ilhan Omar is not going to like where this is heading. The president didn't hold back. He torched the corruption, called out the lies, and for the first time said the quiet part out loud. This fraud network wasn't just stealing taxpayer money. Investigators now believe portions of it may have been routed overseas into extremist controlled regions, not one region, multiple. Let that sink in. Billions missing, visas abused, welfare programs gutted, and the American people stuck with the bill while politicians act like nothing is wrong. Meanwhile, Omar goes on camera pretending none of it matters. They can't deport me, she smirks. I'm not worried. Oh, really? Because Trump just ordered one of the largest ICE sweeps in Minnesota history. Federal investigators are tearing through every fraudulent visa, fake marriage, and suspicious offshore transfer. Why do you think he did that? Tonight, we break down what triggered this escalation, why Ilhan Omar suddenly finds herself in the crosshairs, and how Minnesota became ground zero for the biggest scandal of the year. Buckle up, this one is going to shake the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. The moment President Trump stepped up to the microphone this week, you could feel it. The temperature changed. This wasn't the cautious trade policy Trump. This was Trump fed up with lies, theft, and leaders shrugging off billion-dollar corruption like parking violations. He didn't just address the Minnesota scandal. He detonated it. He laid out point by point how welfare fraud, child care scams, and visa pipelines drained the country for years, and he said plainly, the days of pretending nothing is wrong are over. For the first time, Trump fused immigration enforcement, fraud exposure, and national security into one mission, and Minnesota is now ground zero. And right as this crackdown began, who stepped forward? Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She didn't look worried. She smirked, laughed, and dismissed the outrage as political noise. But what people noticed wasn't her confidence. It was her refusal to acknowledge the magnitude of what is happening in her own backyard. Minnesota has become the epicenter of one of the largest welfare fraud cases in modern U.S. history. Federal agencies are combing through every fake program, suspicious transfer, and fraudulent visa. Yet Omar brushes it off. No accountability, no concern, no acknowledgement of the billions siphoned away. What began with one arrest in Maine has now exploded into a nationwide probe linking COVID aid, crime rings, welfare schemes, money laundering, and political networks stretching from Minneapolis to Washington, D.C. And today, Trump dropped the hammer in a stunning move. His administration terminated TPS protections for Somali nationals, a reversal that sent shockwaves through immigrant communities already bracing for federal raids. We are talking ICE deployments, billions of suspected stolen dollars, and protests erupting across America. Minnesota streets are packed, emotions are boiling, the media is panicking. Democrats are scrambling. Federal prosecutors openly say this may be the biggest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history. Tonight, we walk through how one arrest triggered a national chain reaction, why this scandal exploded, and what ending TPS means for America's immigration future. Buckle up, because you're about to hear the story they never wanted you to connect. Hit the like button and subscribe. So where did this all ignite when federal agents arrested Somali city councilor Ilhan Omar in Maine. They weren't just picking up a local official, they ripped the cover off a powder keg. Osman was indicted on federal gun theft charges after investigators tied him to a drug house where federal agents had seized meth, fentanyl, cocaine, and firearms. When reporters asked for proof of his residency, his lawyer claimed Osman was facing death threats, but police confirmed no such reports existed. What made Washington freeze was the timing. His arrest landed the same week federal agencies were preparing new fraud indictments tied to Somali networks in Minnesota. That wasn't coincidence. It was a spark hitting gasoline. Within hours, investigators began connecting cases they once treated as isolated. Fraud in Minneapolis, laundering in Maine, suspicious nonprofit transfers tied to COVID aid, housing schemes, health billing scams, welfare money routed through clan networks. The same surnames, the same shell companies, the same nonprofits, the same money trails showed up again and again in federal databases. Analysts described the overlap as statistically impossible to be accidental. This wasn't random crime. One DHS official said this was a coordinated national system hiding in plain sight, and Osman's arrest unlocked the entire structure. Back in Minnesota, Omar's dismissiveness only poured gasoline on the fire, raising questions she doesn't want to answer. This state didn't just lose a few $1 million. It oversaw a $1 billion theft network that grew for years under leaders who were asleep or afraid to confront it. Fake daycare centers, fake meal programs, falsified identities, industrial-scale theft of taxpayer money. Trump wasn't going to let it slide. No, the scandal is shifting from financial fraud to national security crisis because investigators aren't just following the money stolen, they're following where it went. Early reports suggest parts of these funds may have ended up overseas in extremist-controlled territories. No accusations against Omar or specific officials, but the networks themselves are now under terrorism financing scrutiny. This is why Trump's tone changed. This is why ICE mobilized. This is why federal agencies are calling this one of the most dangerous failures of state oversight in decades. Because if even a fraction of those funds helped extremist networks abroad, this isn't just theft, it's a threat to national security. And suddenly, Minnesota wasn't a local scandal, it was a national crisis. And that's when the media completely lost it. Trump made a comment that instantly went viral, and headlines immediately claimed he attacked all Somali immigrants. But slow down for a moment. Let's actually look at what he said. Trump clearly stated he was talking about people who live in America, take American benefits, and then turn around and call this country the worst place on earth. He wasn't referring to hardworking Somali Americans who love this nation. He wasn't attacking an entire culture. He was targeting individuals tied to fraud, abuse, and anti-American rhetoric. Trump doubled down, saying he refuses to stay silent while people exploit the system and insult the country that feeds them. Love him or hate him, one thing is undeniable. He didn't back off, didn't soften, and meant every word. But right after Trump clarified his remarks, Minneapolis leadership rushed to the cameras with scripted outrage. The mayor, activists, and local officials insisted Trump was villainizing the Somali community, accusing him of fear-mongering while praising Somali contributions to the city. Let's be clear, nobody is disputing that Somali families, businesses, and lawful residents are valued parts of Minnesota. The issue is not culture. The issue is fraud networks, criminal rings, and political cowardice that have allowed billions to vanish without oversight. Yet Minneapolis officials refused to separate the community from the criminals, hiding within it, that refusal, intentional or political, only intensified the national backlash. Then came the moment that shook Minnesota. Trump authorized a major ICE surge into the state, not symbolic, not for show, a real boots on the ground operation targeting individuals flagged inside the fraud network. The Trump emphasized this wasn't about innocent families or law-abiding immigrants. It was about rooting out fraudulent visas, fake marriages, sham child care programs, and stolen taxpayer dollars. Agencies compiled data, cross-referenced records, and traced financial trails. This wasn't random, it was surgical, and that precision terrified the political establishment because it suggested the government knew exactly who to question. Minnesota felt the weight of enforcement for the first time, and the ripple effects were immediate. Then Minneapolis police chief stepped in, triggering a constitutional firestorm. He told residents that if they saw federal agents enforcing immigration law, they should call 911, suggesting local officers might intervene if people believe their rights were violated. Intervene against federal agents, that isn't community support, it's local government undermining federal law. For Trump's administration, it signaled open rebellion inside sanctuary cities, willing to obstruct investigations to protect narratives. Instead of calming tensions, the city escalated them. Next came one of the most shocking claims. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem alleged that 50% of visa applications in Minnesota showed signs of fraud. That number sounded unbelievable until federal investigators began confirming widespread patterns, sham marriages, fake identities, and applicants claiming relationships that didn't exist. This wasn't sloppiness, it was a pipeline, a conveyor belt feeding billions into fraud-driven welfare networks, and every fraudulent visa meant another way into taxpayer-funded programs, meant struggling American families, not criminal enterprises. This is why Trump snapped. This is why ICE expanded its sweep. Soon, investigators examined overseas remittance data, billions sent abroad each year. They noticed suspicious clusters linked to regions controlled by extremist groups. Nobody said all remittances were illicit, and nobody accused Ilhan Omar personally. But some of the fraud networks under investigation showed financial trails disturbingly close to areas flagged by federal intelligence. Conservative media erupted. Trump's comments suddenly carried force because if even a fraction of stolen Minnesota money ended up overseas, intentionally or not, that means taxpayer funds may have reached hostile groups. This wasn't just politics, it became a national security question. And here's what hits every American watching. The Minnesota scandal isn't just about corruption, as about why groceries cost more, why rent is rising, why hospitals are overloaded, and why paychecks don't stretch. When millions in benefits are siphoned off by people never entitled to them, everyone pays. Illegal access means crowded housing markets, fraudulent SNAP rolls push food prices higher. Overburdened hospitals mean longer waits and higher premiums. Trump argued that reversing Biden-era damage starts with restoring fairness, making sure benefits go to Americans, not fraudsters. So, should leaders who oversaw this collapse face consequences? Should they be investigated, removed, or held responsible? We aren't accusing anyone. We're simply asking the question taxpayers deserve to ask. How did this happen? Why were warnings ignored while fraud ballooned into a national security threat? Trump has signaled that 2026 will be the year of accountability, promising transparency, oversight, and leadership that protects resources rather than looks away. What investigators uncovered shocked even seasoned agents. The famous feeding our future scandal, over 200 $50 million for hungry children disappearing into luxury cars. Overseas transfers and shell nonprofits turned out to be just the surface. Beneath it was a sprawling ecosystem of inflated billing, fake services, and community organizations laundering billions. Federal intelligence briefings suggested that money flowed across state lines and even overseas toward extremist-linked groups. This fraud wasn't accidental. It was strategic, coordinated, and years in the making. A DHS report bluntly called the Minneapolis SDAPHEAC Paul Fraud Network the financial engine behind multiple national schemes. That's when everything erupted nationally. After seeing the scale of fraud and intelligence reports, Trump made the call. Democrats swore he'd never make TPS. Protections for Somali nationals were terminated. Biden expanded TPS, but investigators found duplicate identities, fraudulent claims, and protected status holders sending money into suspicious networks. Trump's reversal instantly exposed thousands to scrutiny, interviews, and in some cases deportation proceedings. The left called it cruelty. Law enforcement called it necessary. Protests exploded from Minneapolis to Seattle. Activists claimed Trump was criminalizing immigrants while ignoring the fact that prosecutors were uncovering one of the largest welfare fraud networks in U.S. history. Police formed lines around courthouses as demonstrators hurled accusations and demanded TPS reinstatement. But beneath the slogans was panic. The fraud network was unraveling. Arrests were expected. Organizations built on taxpayer money were on the brink of collapse. And then the receipts dropped. Federal filings showed multiple Minnesota Democrats took campaign donations from individuals now charged in the Feeding Our Future case. These weren't accidental donations. These were key players now facing indictments. Legacy media rushed into damage control. CNN and MSNBC painted Somali networks as victims and Trump as the aggressor, while downplaying missing billions and children who never received food. But the more media tried to bury the truth, the more the public demanded answers. Ilhan Omar went on CNN blaming program design flaws but never mentioned stolen billions, organized networks, or cultural patterns identified by scholars involving clan loyalties and informal economies. Federal investigators weren't buying the narrative. They had names, transfers, coordinated groups, and repeated patterns across states. Identity politics collided with accountability, and reality grew harder to hide. Then the country saw something impossible to ignore before sunrise. Federal tactical teams rolled into Minneapolis. St. Paul armored vehicles, ICE units, Homeland Security agents, and enforcement teams served warrants and executed removal orders. Residents watched from their windows as properties were raided and suspects taken into custody. Soon, investigators discovered identical fraud fingerprints in Ohio, Washington, Maine, Colorado, and Texas, proving this wasn't a Minnesota problem. DHS analysts now say this may be the largest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history. Meanwhile, Omar smirked on camera, saying they can't deport me, but Trump launched one of the largest ICE sweeps in state history. Federal agents are combing through every fraudulent visa, fake marriage, and overseas transfer. Why do you think that is? Tonight, we'll unpack what triggered Trump's explosion, why Ilhan Omar is suddenly in the crosshairs, and how Minnesota became ground zero for the biggest scandal of the year. No accusations against Ilhan Omar personally, no claims against any specific official. The focus is on the fraud networks themselves. Those networks are now under a terrorism finance spotlight. That's why Trump's tone shifted. That's why ICE was deployed. That's why the president called this one of the biggest oversight failures in decades. Because if even a fraction of this money touched extremist activity overseas, then this isn't just theft, it's a pipeline that could endanger American security. Suddenly, Minnesota wasn't a local scandal, it was a national risk. This is where the media spun out of control. Trump made his now viral comment, and instantly headlines accused him of attacking all Somali immigrants. But pause for a moment. Look at what Trump actually said. He specified he was targeting people who live in America, take American benefits, and then call the country the worst place on earth. He wasn't talking about hardworking Somali Americans who contribute to this nation. He wasn't condemning an entire culture. His target was individuals tied to fraud, abuse, and anti-American rhetoric. Trump doubled down, saying he will not stay silent while people exploit the system and trash the nation that feeds them. Love him or hate him, one thing is undeniable. He didn't retreat. He didn't soften. He stood by every word. But right after Trump clarified his remarks, Minneapolis leaders rushed in with scripted talking points. The mayor, activists, and local officials insisted the Somali community was being demonized, accusing Trump of fear-mongering and emphasizing that Somali residents are a valued part of the city. They highlighted Somali-owned businesses, cultural contributions, and law-abiding families who serve the community. Let's be clear, no one disputes that the issue was never Somali culture or Somali families. The issue was the fraud rings, the criminal networks, and the political cowardice that let billions disappear without oversight. That's the problem. Yet Minnesota officials refuse to separate the community from the criminals hiding within it. That refusal, whether political or intentional, lit the next stage of this firestorm. Instead of cooling tensions, they poured fuel on them. Then came the moment that shook Minnesota. Trump authorized a major ICE surge into the state, not symbolic, real boots on the ground enforcement targeting individuals flagged inside the fraud web. And Trump emphasized repeatedly the sweep wasn't aimed at innocent families, legal residents, or law-abiding immigrants. It was aimed at those tied to fraudulent visas, sham marriages, fake child care networks, and stolen taxpayer funds. Federal agencies built a list, tracked financial transfers, and matched identities. This wasn't random, it was surgical, and that precision terrified political circles because it meant the government knew exactly where to look and who to question. For the first time, Minnesota felt the full weight of federal enforcement, and the ripple effects were immediate. And just when tensions peaked, Minneapolis police chief lit a constitutional showdown. He told residents to call 911 if they saw federal agents in their neighborhoods enforcing immigration law. He implied local officers might intervene if someone felt their civil rights were violated. Intervene against federal agents, that is in community protection. That essay, city government challenging federal authority to Trump's administration. It signaled something deeper. Sanctuary cities now willing to obstruct investigations to protect political narratives. That statement didn't diffuse the crisis, it escalated it, raising legal concerns, safety questions, and forcing Americans to ask what happens when local police and federal agents collide over the same suspect. Then came another shock, the visa fraud explosion. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem claimed that half of Minnesota's visa applications showed signs of fraud. 50%. That number seemed unbelievable until federal investigators began confirming the patterns: sham marriages for legal status, fake identities to access benefits, applicants claiming relatives who don't even exist in the same hemisphere. This wasn't incompetence, it was a pipeline, a conveyor belt of fraudulent entries feeding the same welfare networks, already draining billions from taxpayers. Every fraudulent visa was another entry point into benefits meant for struggling American families, not criminal enterprises. This is why Trump snapped, why the ICE sweep grew, why the country is paying attention. Then came a report that hit Omar's own district. Ilhan Omar visibly panicked. Investigators reviewing billions in overseas remittances found suspicious clusters around regions controlled by extremist groups. No one accused Omar personally, but financial trails tied to fraud networks overlapped disturbingly with areas flagged by federal intelligence. Conservative media exploded, and Trump's comments landed even harder because if even a small fraction of Minnesota's stolen welfare cash wound up overseas, intentionally or not, it meant taxpayer dollars might have indirectly reached groups hostile to the U.S. Suddenly, Omar's district wasn't just a political debate, it became a national security conversation. And here's the part every American relates to. This scandal isn't just about corruption or incompetence. It's about affordability. It's about why groceries cost more, rent rises, hospitals overflow, and paychecks don't go as far as they did 10 years ago. Trump argued that when billions in benefits go to people who were never entitled to them, everyone else pays. Illegal payouts mean crowded housing, inflated grocery prices due to fraud, swollen food programs, and overloaded hospitals with rising premiums. He argued that reversing Biden-era damage starts with restoring fairness, making sure benefits go to Americans, not criminal networks. This scandal isn't isolated. It's a symptom of a system stretched beyond breaking. So now we end with a question millions are asking. Fraud on this scale doesn't happen without political failure. Should the leaders who presided over Minnesota's collapse face consequences? Should they be investigated, removed, held accountable for billions lost under their watch? We aren't accusing anyone of crimes. We're asking the question Americans deserve to ask. How did this happen? Why were warnings ignored? While the fraud ballooned into a national security threat, Trump has already signaled that 2026 will be the year of accountability, promising transparency, oversight, and leadership that protects America's resources. So now it's your turn. What should happen next? Who should answer for what Minnesota allowed to unfold? Tell us in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.